The forest around Bitterroot Creek doesn't make much sound anymore. The trees stand motionless, their trunks gray and slick like the bones of something ancient. Locals say even the birds stopped nesting there after the Donnelly family vanished. In the winter of 1876, when the snow came early and didn't melt for months, no one dared to travel that far north. The Donnellys had built their cabin deep within those woods, a place too quiet, too far from the world, and too full of secrets. They weren't a family people talked about openly. The few who remembered them did so in hushed tones, as if afraid the mere mention might wake something long buried. The Donnelly patriarch, Thomas, had come west with his wife, Maeve, and their 6 children, each one said to have been born with something off in their eyes, in their faces, in the way they moved. Some said it was inbreeding. Others whispered it was a curse or worse, an experiment that had gone wrong. When travelers passed their land, they spoke of strange lights flickering in the trees and the echo of laughter that didn't sound entirely human. A midwife who once helped deliver a Donnelly child fled before dawn, refusing to speak of what she saw. And when the sheriff went out to check on them a year later, he came back white as the snow itself, muttering that no man should live that far from God. By spring, the Donnellys were gone. All that remained was their cabin, its door hanging open, the hearth still smoldering as if someone had just stepped out. Inside, the walls were scratched with symbols no one could read, and in the cellar, there was a hole. Deep. Wet. Breathing. People in Montana still say that if you stand by Bitterroot Creek on a cold night, you can hear the sound of something crawling beneath the frozen earth, something carrying the Donnelly blood. In the late autumn of 1876, the Donnelly family arrived in Montana under a heavy sky that seemed to press down on the mountains themselves. Thomas Donnelly, a man with sharp, restless eyes and a silence that made others uneasy, led his wife Maeve and their 6 children into the Bitterroot wilderness. They came with little more than a wagon, a pair of mules, and a reputation that had followed them from the last 2 towns they'd fled. In Helena, people whispered about their strange looks, their eyes too pale, their skin oddly translucent in the light, and how their children rarely spoke, as if words were something foreign to them. The locals said the Donnellys were cursed, that their blood carried something unnatural, but Thomas claimed they only wanted peace, a place where no one would judge them for what they couldn't change. They built their home at the edge of a clearing surrounded by black pine and frozen creek beds, a place so remote it didn't appear on most maps. The land was unforgiving, thin soil, harsh winters, but Thomas seemed drawn to it, as if he'd been searching for this precise isolation. The cabin went up fast, built from rough-hewn logs and sealed with mud. At night, smoke curled from its chimney in odd bursts, as if the fire inside flickered with more than wood and flame. Their presence unsettled nearby settlers almost immediately. Hunters passing through reported seeing the Donnelly children staring at them from the tree line, motionless, their pupils wide and colorless even in daylight. Some swore the family kept to the woods at night, muttering in a language no one recognized. The few traders who visited said Maeve was polite but distant, her hands constantly trembling as she exchanged goods for salt, cloth, and occasionally animal bones. When one trader asked about their move west, Thomas only replied that the mountains would keep them safe, though from what, he never said. The sound of hammering and digging echoed late into the night for weeks, and when spring thawed the ground, the Donnellys fenced off a section of the forest and forbade anyone from crossing it. Children from nearby homesteads who wandered too close claimed to see strange pits lined with animal hides and bones, and once, a pale figure crawling from the ground before vanishing into the trees. By the first frost, the Donnellys had completely withdrawn from any contact with the outside world. The trail leading to their cabin became overgrown, and the faint light from their windows dimmed until no one could tell if they were still living there at all. The woods grew silent around them, as if nature itself had learned to hold its breath in their presence. The winter of 1877 came early to the Bitterroot Mountains, and with it, the cries of Maeve Donnelly giving birth to her 7th child echoed through the frozen forest. A midwife named Clara Hensley, a woman known for her steady hands and quiet courage, had been summoned from a nearby settlement to assist. The journey to the Donnelly cabin was long and tense, the path buried under snow so deep it silenced her horse's hooves. Clara later said she felt watched the entire way, as though unseen eyes followed her from the dark trees. When she reached the cabin, the first thing she noticed was the smell, damp earth, smoke, and something metallic beneath it, like rust or blood. The Donnelly children stood by the doorway, their faces half hidden in shadow, staring without blinking. Inside, Maeve was already in labor, her pale skin slick with sweat despite the cold air seeping through the cracks in the walls. Thomas stood nearby, silent, his expression unreadable. The flickering fire cast their shadows across the log walls, making their movements appear distorted, elongated, unnatural. Clara tried to steady her nerves as she worked, but the silence in the room felt wrong. Even the mother's cries seemed muffled, as if swallowed by the house itself. When the baby finally came, the midwife wrapped it quickly in a blanket before she dared look. What she saw beneath the cloth froze her blood. The child was alive, breathing weakly, but its skin had a strange translucence that made its veins visible like fine blue threads beneath parchment. Its eyes, when they opened, were large and gray, too large for its face, and the pupils shifted like liquid mercury in the light. The infant made no sound, no cry, no whimper, just a faint clicking noise deep in its throat, as if trying to mimic a sound it had never heard before. Clara gasped, nearly dropping it, but Maeve's hand shot out to stop her, gripping her wrist with unnatural strength. The mother's eyes were full of desperate warning rather than fear, and she whispered, "Don't speak of it." Thomas stepped forward, taking the child gently but firmly, and carried it toward the cellar door at the back of the cabin. The air grew colder when he opened it. Clara didn't wait to see more. She grabbed her satchel and fled into the storm without collecting her pay, stumbling through the snow as the sound of that strange clicking followed her into the night. She returned to the settlement half frozen and hysterical, refusing to describe what she'd seen. She left Montana within days. After that night, no one saw her again, but those who passed through the Bitterroot Woods swore they could still hear a baby crying softly beneath the ground long after the snow had melted. By the spring of 1878, the Donnelly homestead had taken on a reputation that made even the bravest men hesitate to approach it. The traders who once brought supplies no longer rode that way, and hunters avoided the forest trails near Bitterroot Creek after dusk. Word spread that those who ventured too close didn't always come back. It started with a pair of trappers, brothers who set up camp a mile from the Donnelly property. They were experienced men, the kind who could navigate the woods blindfolded, but after one night of unsettling noises echoing through the trees, low, rhythmic sounds that resembled breathing, they were never seen again. When a search party found their camp, the fire was still burning, their rifles untouched, and strange symbols were carved into the snow around the site. No tracks led away, only deep impressions in the earth, as though something heavy had moved beneath it. Then it was a peddler named Henry Coates, a talkative man who often sold buttons and trinkets to the isolated settlers. He'd told a friend in town he planned to visit the Donnellys to trade for animal pelts. He left on a Thursday morning with a full cart. By the following week, his mule returned without him, dragging an empty wagon, its canvas torn to ribbons. There were stains along the wooden slats, dark and dry. The sheriff made a half-hearted attempt to investigate but stopped when he reached the edge of the Donnelly clearing. He claimed the air there didn't move right, and the trees seemed to twist away from the path. As more men went missing, the stories grew darker. Travelers who dared pass by the homestead at night reported seeing faint lanterns swinging in the trees, and the sound of laughter echoing through the branches. Some said they saw the Donnelly children walking in a line across the clearing, hand in hand, their pale faces lifted toward the moon, their mouths moving in silent rhythm. Others spoke of a smell like burned hair and meat drifting from the cabin chimney at odd hours. A prospector who stumbled onto their land by mistake claimed to see bones piled neatly behind the house, stripped clean and white, before Thomas appeared in the doorway and told him to leave if he valued his life. By midsummer, the Donnelly name had become a warning whispered in every saloon and church pew in the valley. Parents told their children not to wander past the creek, and the few who dared to hunt near that part of the forest swore that when night fell, the woods themselves seemed to pulse with something alive, watching, and waiting for anyone foolish enough to step too close to the Donnelly cabin. By the winter of 1878, the disappearances around the Bitterroot Woods had become too many to ignore. Sheriff Amos Grady, a man known for his skepticism and iron will, decided he would see for himself what was happening on the Donnelly property. He had heard the rumors, stories of lights in the trees, strange chanting, people vanishing without a trace, but he dismissed them as backwoods superstition. Armed with his revolver, a lantern, and a deputy who refused to go farther than the first ridge, Grady rode alone into the snow-cloaked forest. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. Even the wind seemed to die away, leaving only the crunch of his boots and the creak of his saddle. When he reached the Donnelly clearing, the first thing he noticed was the smell. It was faint but unmistakable, a sour, metallic stench that reminded him of blood left too long in the sun. The cabin stood crooked against the gray sky, smoke curling weakly from its chimney. Grady knocked on the door, but no one answered. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The fire was still burning, but the room felt wrong, too warm and too silent. The furniture was handmade, crude but tidy, and the walls were covered in markings, strange circular symbols drawn in charcoal that seemed to shimmer in the flickering light. He called out, but his voice sounded muted, swallowed by the room itself. In the corner, a small cradle rocked slowly, though there was no wind. When Grady approached, he found it empty, its bedding damp as though something had just been lifted out. He noticed footprints near the cellar door, bare, small, and leading downward. A low humming noise rose from beneath the floor, faint but rhythmic, like breathing. He reached for the latch, but the instant his hand touched it, a wave of nausea hit him so hard he staggered back. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of decay. He stumbled outside, gasping for breath, and when he looked toward the tree line, he saw them, figures standing in the dark, half hidden between the trunks. Their eyes reflected the lamplight like animal eyes, too many of them to count. Grady fled, riding hard through the woods until his horse nearly collapsed. When he reached town at dawn, his face was gray and his hands shook uncontrollably. He never spoke of what he saw that night. When asked about the Donnellys, he simply said, "They're still there. But they ain't what they used to be." After that, he refused to set foot in those woods again, and whenever a storm rolled over the valley, he was seen staring toward the mountains, as if listening for something he prayed would never return. Years after the Donnellys vanished from the Bitterroot Woods, a diary surfaced in the attic of an abandoned homestead 50 miles south of where their cabin once stood. The small leather-bound book belonged to Eileen Donnelly, a distant cousin who had lived briefly with the family before leaving in early 1877. Her writings were brittle with age, the ink faded to brown, but the words that remained painted a picture darker than any legend. She described her time in the Donnelly home as suffocating, filled with an unshakable sense that something beneath that house was alive. The family rarely spoke to one another, communicating instead through glances or quiet murmurs at night when they thought she was asleep. She wrote that Thomas Donnelly kept a locked trapdoor in the floor, one he told her never to touch, and that the children sometimes carried food, raw meat, bones, jars of milk, down into it after dark. The most unsettling entries began with her mention of the other one. At first, she seemed unsure whether it was real or imagined. She wrote that she could hear it moving beneath the floorboards at night, scraping, whispering, breathing. Maeve once told her that it was sick and had to stay below where the air was cold, but Eileen's curiosity grew until one night she lifted the trapdoor while the family slept. She described the smell as unbearable, thick and foul, and the sound that came from the darkness below as wet and irregular, like something dragging itself closer. When she shone her lantern down, she saw a shape that made her drop it in terror, a child's face, but not quite human. Its skin was gray and thin as paper, and its eyes gleamed with a milky light that reflected her own. It spoke her name in a whisper that didn't sound like a voice at all, but a thought crawling through her head. She slammed the door shut and fled into the night, taking only the clothes on her back. Her final entry was written from a neighboring town several days later. In it, she claimed the Donnellys weren't a family but, a line continued, something that began generations before and should have ended long ago. She said Thomas had made a promise to keep the blood alive, that the child in the cellar was not born but made. After that entry, her writing stopped abruptly. The diary was found beside a broken chair, as if she'd left in a hurry. Historians who read it dismissed it as hysteria or religious delusion, but the locals knew better. They said the Donnellys always had one more child than anyone could count, and that some nights, you could still hear that extra voice whispering beneath the ground where their house once stood. The winter of 1879 was one of the harshest the Bitterroot Mountains had ever seen. Snow buried the forests in silence, and temperatures dropped so low that even the rivers seemed to groan under the ice. The Donnellys, cut off from the nearest settlement by more than 20 miles of impassable terrain, vanished completely from the minds of the few who still whispered their name. For months, no one ventured near their land, and the trail that once led to their clearing disappeared beneath the drifts. When spring finally broke, a group of hunters stumbled upon what remained of their homestead, though none of them would ever forget what they found there. The cabin still stood, but barely. The roof had collapsed inward, as if something heavy had pushed against it from within. The door hung off its hinges, and inside, the air was thick with the scent of rot and smoke. The hearth was cold, but the ashes were damp, as though the fire had only recently died. Scattered across the dirt floor were bones, some small and brittle, others far too large to belong to any animal known in those woods. What struck the men most was the state of the cooking pot left on the stove. It was blackened and cracked, but still warm to the touch. Inside were fragments of bone, hair, and something that looked disturbingly like human teeth. One of the hunters, a man named Pike Danner, found tracks outside the cabin leading toward the tree-line. They were deep, erratic, and barefoot despite the lingering frost. He followed them for a short distance before realizing they circled back toward the cabin in an impossible loop, as if something had been pacing endlessly in the snow. Near the edge of the property stood what looked like a crude pit covered in rotting boards. When the men pried them open, the stench that rose up was unbearable. Inside were bones piled in tangled heaps, many of them gnawed clean. Some were human, others warped, their shapes unnatural, like they had been caught halfway between species. The hunters fled, but word of what they'd seen spread quickly through the valley. When the sheriff finally organized a search party weeks later, the cabin was gone, burned to its foundation, leaving only charred earth and the faint outline of that pit. No bodies were ever found. Locals said the woods had taken the Donnellys back, that the family had turned on itself during the long winter, consuming what was left of its own bloodline. Others whispered something darker, that the Donnellys hadn't died at all, but had gone underground, into the cold and hollow spaces beneath the Bitterroot, where the ground still shifted on quiet nights as if something was moving just below the surface. By the summer of 1880, the valley had grown tired of the whispers. The stories of the Donnelly family had taken root like a sickness, infecting every conversation, every dark corner of the taverns and churches in town. Parents warned their children never to stray past the creek. Travelers who passed through the area spoke of seeing strange lights moving in the woods and hearing the faint sound of a woman singing somewhere far off among the trees. It was then that the townspeople made a decision, one that would never be recorded in any official ledger. They would erase the Donnellys from history. It was not justice they sought but survival, as if by blotting out their name they could cleanse the land itself of what had taken place there. A group of 12 men, led by Sheriff Amos Grady and the local preacher, set out one night under a new moon. They carried kerosene, shovels, and rifles, though most admitted later that they did not expect to use them. The air was heavy, and even the horses refused to move closer once they reached the clearing. The Donnelly cabin stood in eerie stillness, smoke curling faintly from its chimney despite no sign of life. The men spread out cautiously, the preacher murmuring prayers under his breath. When they stepped inside, they found the walls covered again in symbols, more of them than before, darker, etched into the wood as if burned from within. The cellar door was sealed shut with iron nails, and something behind it scratched faintly against the boards. No one spoke of opening it. Grady ordered the men to douse the walls with kerosene, his voice trembling as he did. The preacher hesitated, saying they should bless the ground first, but the sheriff shook his head. "This ground won't take a blessing," he said. The fire caught quickly, roaring up the sides of the cabin, its smoke turning thick and black. As they retreated into the woods, one of the men swore he saw movement inside, a figure standing in the window, pale and still, holding what looked like a child. The heat drove them back, and by dawn nothing remained but smoldering ash and the faint outline of that curse. When Marin reported his findings, the local authorities dismissed him, calling his claims sensational nonsense meant to draw attention to himself. Yet the dig was quietly halted, the graves reburied, and the cemetery locked behind a new iron gate. Marin, however, could not let it go. He wrote letters to state universities and medical societies, describing his discovery and asking for examination. Only one letter ever came back, from a professor in Boston who had studied hereditary deformities. The professor's reply was brief: "If your account is true, these remains are not aberrations of man or beast, but something between." Marin left Bitterroot Hollow soon after. Locals said he began drinking heavily and refused to sleep indoors, muttering that, "the ground still breathes." When his house was later sold, neighbors found boxes of notes and sketches of bones, each labeled with the same haunting word scrawled across the margins: "return." None of the Donnelly graves have ever been opened again. In 1978, nearly a century after the Donnellys had been consumed by both rumor and time, a team of genetic researchers from the University of Montana began conducting a study on hereditary disorders among isolated mountain communities. Their aim was purely scientific, to trace mutations caused by generations of intermarriage among small frontier populations. But as they began collecting blood samples from families in the Bitterroot region, something unexpected emerged in the data. Several participants, all of whom traced their lineage to settlers who had arrived in the late 1800s, carried a unique mitochondrial marker that did not match any known genetic profile in North America. It was older, foreign, and disturbingly distinct, as if it belonged to a lineage that should have died out long ago. The researchers at first believed it to be an anomaly, perhaps contamination, but the pattern persisted. It appeared in multiple families who swore they had no common ancestry, except for one detail: they all lived within 50 miles of where the Donnelly homestead had once stood. The deeper the study went, the stranger the findings became. Subjects who carried the marker exhibited subtle but consistent traits: unnaturally pale skin that burned easily, unusually sharp hearing, and a peculiar resistance to certain diseases. More alarming were the reports of identical physical features among those unrelated by name: wide, colorless eyes and a faint silver hue in the iris visible only under certain light. Some participants even confessed to having recurring dreams of dark woods and a house with no door, details eerily similar across individuals who had never met. When the lead geneticist, Dr. Helen Voss, cross-referenced the genetic material with historical archives, she found fragments of documentation from 1876 listing the Donnelly family as among the earliest settlers of the Bitterroot region. The mitochondrial sequences matched perfectly with what remained of a preserved blood sample from a Donnelly descendant held in an old medical collection. The revelation unsettled the scientific community. How could a family erased from history still echo so distinctly through the DNA of those living nearby? When Dr. Voss attempted to publish her findings, the university quietly withdrew its support, citing insufficient evidence and ethical concerns. The samples were confiscated by federal agents who claimed jurisdiction under biohazard protocols. Not long after, Dr. Voss vanished during a routine field trip to Bitterroot Hollow. Her car was found abandoned on a dirt road, the keys still in the ignition, her notebook open to a single unfinished sentence: "they never left the woods." Years later, unmarked government vehicles were seen near the same area, and locals spoke again of strange lights among the trees and the sound of whispering voices rising with the wind. Whatever the Donnellys had been, their blood had not disappeared, it had simply adapted, spreading quietly through generations, waiting for something to awaken it once more. In 1978, nearly a century after the Donnellys had been consumed by both rumor and time, a team of genetic researchers from the University of Montana began conducting a study on hereditary disorders among isolated mountain communities. Their aim was purely scientific, to trace mutations caused by generations of intermarriage among small frontier populations. But as they began collecting blood samples from families in the Bitterroot region, something unexpected emerged in the data. Several participants, all of whom traced their lineage to settlers who had arrived in the late 1800s, carried a unique mitochondrial marker that did not match any known genetic profile in North America. It was older, foreign, and disturbingly distinct, as if it belonged to a lineage that should have died out long ago. The researchers at first believed it to be an anomaly, perhaps contamination, but the pattern persisted. It appeared in multiple families who swore they had no common ancestry, except for one detail: they all lived within 50 miles of where the Donnelly homestead had once stood. The deeper the study went, the stranger the findings became. Subjects who carried the marker exhibited subtle but consistent traits: unnaturally pale skin that burned easily, unusually sharp hearing, and a peculiar resistance to certain diseases. More alarming were the reports of identical physical features among those unrelated by name: wide, colorless eyes and a faint silver hue in the iris visible only under certain light. Some participants even confessed to having recurring dreams of dark woods and a house with no door, details eerily similar across individuals who had never met. When the lead geneticist, Dr. Helen Voss, cross-referenced the genetic material with historical archives, she found fragments of documentation from 1876 listing the Donnelly family as among the earliest settlers of the Bitterroot region. The mitochondrial sequences matched perfectly with what remained of a preserved blood sample from a Donnelly descendant held in an old medical collection. The revelation unsettled the scientific community. How could a family erased from history still echo so distinctly through the DNA of those living nearby? When Dr. Voss attempted to publish her findings, the university quietly withdrew its support, citing insufficient evidence and ethical concerns. The samples were confiscated by federal agents who claimed jurisdiction under biohazard protocols. Not long after, Dr. Voss vanished during a routine field trip to Bitterroot Hollow. Her car was found abandoned on a dirt road, the keys still in the ignition, her notebook open to a single unfinished sentence: "they never left the woods." Years later, unmarked government vehicles were seen near the same area, and locals spoke again of strange lights among the trees and the sound of whispering voices rising with the wind. Whatever the Donnellys had been, their blood had not disappeared, it had simply adapted, spreading quietly through generations, waiting for something to awaken it once more. In the autumn of 1994, a group of hikers exploring the Bitterroot wilderness stumbled upon a section of forest that wasn't marked on any modern maps. The trees there were older, taller, their roots twisted into the earth like the veins of something ancient. The hikers, 3 friends from Missoula, had been following a dry creek bed when one of them noticed a depression in the ground, half covered by moss and rotting leaves. Brushing the debris aside, they uncovered a wooden hatch sealed with rusted nails and iron bands, the remnants of what looked like an old root cellar. At first, they thought it was a relic from some forgotten homestead, but the air that seeped through the cracks carried a foul, earthy smell, sharp enough to make them gag. The wood was blackened but intact, as though preserved by something unnatural. Despite the unease that settled over them, curiosity drove them to pry it open. When the hatch finally gave way with a sharp crack, a rush of cold, damp air spilled out, smelling of mold, decay, and something faintly metallic. Their flashlight beams caught the glimmer of frost on the stairs leading down into the dark. The walls were lined with thick roots that pulsed faintly, as if alive. They descended only a few steps before one of them froze, whispering that he heard breathing, slow, rhythmic, deep beneath the ground. Another dismissed it as an echo, but then they all heard it, a low, guttural sound that rose and fell like the exhale of something massive. The temperature dropped sharply, and the lights flickered. When one of the hikers aimed his flashlight deeper into the cellar, the beam landed on what looked like a figure crouched in the far corner. Its skin reflected the light like wet paper, and its eyes, milky white and wide, blinked once before the light went out completely. They bolted from the clearing, tripping over roots and stones in their panic. Two made it back to their camp before sunrise, but the third never returned.